Well, hello everyone. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to TNC's latest Down the Wire podcast. And today's topic is an absolute cracker. Mobile procurement. There's a storm coming. I'm John Waterhouse, CEO of TNC. I'll be your host for the next 20 minutes. As I'm sure everyone joining knows, TNC is the UK's largest independent network and telecom strategy and sourcing consultancy. Support over 280 major UK and multinational organisations and help them to get the best possible commercial, technical, operational and contractual results from all their network and telecom solutions. Joining us today to share his expertise is our head of consulting and lead mobile expert, Adrian Joyce. Adrian, would you like to say hello to our viewers and listeners?
Yes, hello John, hello everyone.
Great to have you, Adrian.
Thank you.
So, as promised, today's topic is super interesting, and I know it is not going to disappoint. We've got an absolute ton to cover. We're going to touch on Brexit and its impact on EU roaming. We're going to talk about 5G use cases. We're going to talk about the post-COVID mobile environment and lots in between. As Adrian put it so beautifully in the opening paragraph of his white paper on exactly this topic, over the years, mobile procurement has assumed almost a utility feel as prices were reduced, tech funds lessened, mobile devices retained for ever longer periods, and coverage issues declined, with improved coverage and Wi-Fi calling. Frankly, not much change from one procurement cycle to the next. However, there is a perfect storm forming that will change all the above and may mean your next mobile procurement will be the hardest and most important in a decade. It's pretty stirring words. So look, Adrian, let's get straight into it. You say there's a storm coming. Your next mobile procurement might well be your hardest and most important in a decade. So, simple question, why?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. There's probably a culmination of factors at play here, John, and I think it all comes down to a few basic factors that are important to all procurements. That's risk, the impact cost, and the possibility of opportunities lost. So the topics we're going to talk about today, on their own, don't warrant too much individual attention, but put them all together. And yes, this is a really important period for mobile procurement, because you get this wrong on one or two of these factors, and the risks, the opportunities lost, etc., just multiply. So the procurements that we're running at the moment, we're seeing really contrasting deals dependent on some of those factors. So yeah, you can't just run a procurement like you did last time and perhaps miss or ignore some of these factors. You do so at your peril.
So is it fair to say that this is one of those situations where, looking at it optimistically, there's a great deal to be done, but there's a lot of risk that if you don't take these factors seriously, if you don't address them effectively, you could end up with a pretty awful outcome?
Oh, undoubtedly. I think mobile remains very competitive. So, we're running tenders at the moment where we're seeing substantial savings. So it's still possible. But yes, there are these factors creeping in that you just need to be aware of. You need to try and mitigate. You need to understand, and you need to see the differences between the tenders put on, or the responses to RFPs put on the table, and actually draw those factors out. And some of them would be easy to miss or to not understand the materiality of them, I think. So putting them all together definitely feels a lot different to procurements for certainly the last 3, 4, 5 years.
And the key difference being that the opportunity for this to go drastically wrong has increased. So it's not just, yes, there's always been upside available in mobile, prices are coming down, and we'll talk about that. But now the downside risk has increased. If you don't put the right planning in place, if you don't have the right strategy, if you're not aware of these issues and so on, you really could end up with a pretty nasty end state.
Yeah, and it's interesting actually. Just perhaps to go off a slight tangent before we get into some of the parameters that we want to talk about today is the sort of average length of the mobile deal. Um, in the past, we generally predicated on 2-year deals. It tended to be the refresh cycle for mobile devices. But because mobile devices have become so expensive, your top end Samsungs and Apples, several £100 at least. And because those devices are not changing as much from one iteration to another and lasting longer, and people are taking better care of them, generally we're seeing that device estates aren't being refreshed as regularly. And that used to be the trigger to have a next procurement cycle, to get a new tech fund in, potentially to help or to pay for device refresh. And we've kind of diverged from that. And some of the other factors that we're going to talk about today, particularly the impact of Brexit and the potential to introduce EU roaming charges in the future. Our advice to customers at the moment is actually to try and lock in pricing for a longer period. Now, we're not talking 5-year deals. Mobile moves too fast. There's too much happening. 5G, I was going to say on the horizon. It's here, but it's still very early in the day. But we are suggesting to customers perhaps to lock in for 3 years, just to give yourself that sort of security, particularly when you don't have the device refresh tension behind you. So yeah, it's important therefore that the other factors aren't ignored.
Well, presumably, particularly because if you are locking in for longer, if you do end up with problems around how you're dealing with things like EU roaming or inflation, and we'll come back to some of these points in a second, you've got to live with that problem for an awful lot longer.
Absolutely,
which really compounds the risk.
Compound is exactly the word. Yeah.
Okay, so let's drill down into a few of those topics in a bit more detail. You talked about EU roaming post Brexit. I know you're very keen to talk about inflation, and we definitely will. Post COVID changes. Can you talk us through what are some of these downsides, some of these risks that you're identifying?
Yeah, so let's start with EU roaming and Brexit. So under EU regulation, there was Roam Like at Home legislation that meant that your use of your device in the EU and a couple of other associated countries was the same as your domestic use. So if you got inclusive calls, if you had an average of 2 gig of data or a 10 terabyte pool of data, and you're in France or Poland or wherever, your usage was the same in terms of its cost profile as your usage in the UK. Fantastic for organizations that worked in Europe, but in particular, fantastic as consumers or as enterprise users, just purely on holiday. Did you want to do a bit of work? Well, it's not going to cost anything. So in terms of roaming. So that was great. Obviously, there's this thing called Brexit that happened, and the result is that those regulations are no longer enforceable against the mobile network operators. And what we've seen over the last year and a half, or perhaps a year, in the consumer space, we predicted would happen in the enterprise space, and we're beginning to see that. So in the consumer space, all but O2 have altered or have come back with pricing for EU roaming. So typically it's something like £2 a day to roam in the EU. So I mean, it's not too bad. It's only £2 a day. However, multiply that up by hundreds or thousands of users over a summer holiday period over 2 weeks. That's on the assumption we're allowed to travel once again. It begins to add up, and this may only be the start of a slippery slope. When does it become £2.50? When does it become £5? So we were concerned that this would bleed into the enterprise space. It's a bit bizarre mobility. It tends to be led by the consumer space, and enterprise sort of catches up in some respects. And now, unfortunately, my Mystic Meg crystal ball has proven to be correct. We are now seeing some enterprise deals coming through with charging for EU roaming. So we can look to mitigate that in negotiations. We can look to mitigate that in the questions that we ask in RFPs. But it's essential, one, that we do that, but two, that when you're looking at these deals, that you take that into account. You see the contrast between the vendor, the operator not charging you, and the one that's only charging you a couple of pounds. And again, understanding the impact of that. Of course, with COVID, all your recent usage data for the last year and a half doesn't reflect what you might do over the next 2-3 years. Again, on the assumption that we go back to our summer beach holidays, that could have a big impact. So again, it's easy to go, oh, well, we only had 500 days in Europe last year. It's only £1,000. Let's not worry about it. But if that becomes 5,000 days or 10,000 days, obviously, the maths generates more of a difference between one deal and the other. I think the other aspect of this, very briefly, is the ability in some contracts for the vendor to change the pricing mid-contract. So, of course, we're always very anti that for obvious reasons. We try and keep it fixed. But there are some contracts and some smaller contracts, and particularly renewals, where you might not have the capability to negotiate that away. And again, what that might mean is that you start with £2 a day, but actually it becomes £3 next year, £5 the year after. So again, something to really, really focus the mind on.
And presumably, as you rightly say, partly because of COVID, your current usage profile might not include so much roaming, so you might not see this. But I guess as well, because your EU roaming isn't called out in your current bill, even if you look back at a pre-COVID bill, you wouldn't see that EU roaming in there, so you wouldn't necessarily therefore identify it as an additional cost when you take your new tariff and model it against your pre-COVID usage profile. You wouldn't see that EU roaming, so it wouldn't get pulled out.
Yeah, it's a strong possibility. For those of you foolish enough not to get our assistance with this sort of stuff, then yeah, that could happen.
Who would make such a mistake?
I don't know, John.
Surely no one.
But certainly when we're pulling the usage together to put into a pricing template, we are focused on the difference between EU and rest of the world data. But yes, you're right, and this can be compounded by the different ways that the operators, your incumbent operator, presents their billing for roaming. So some do it into zones, and you might find that there are some countries that don't quite fit into the zones that a new vendor would present you with. So trying to get that lower level, country level detail is very important, not just for EU roaming, but for example, if you're going off to I don't know, the Seychelles, Mauritius, Andorra, Saudi Arabia.
Sounds like your summer.
All these top hotspots, that you can have a distinct difference from one vendor to another. So it is important to get that country level detail.
So I know the next, one of the other big risks you started to call out, and keen to get your views on, is the creeping return of inflation. What would we call it? Automatic cost increases, sort of coming back into contracts.
Yeah. So
Talk to us about that.
Yeah, again, consumer space led. So Ofcom altered their rules about 2 years ago, roughly, that allowed this to happen. I think that it was. I could talk at length about the reasons why, etc. It's happened. So in the consumer space, it's very common, if you see any of the adverts on TV for any mobile deal, to hear CPI plus 3.9%. Again, we feared that this would creep into the enterprise space once tested in the consumer world, get people used to it, get used to the adverts. Well, we've managed to do it in consumer space as an MNO or as a mobile vendor. Should we try it in the enterprise space? And sure enough, they have, and it's creeping in. Now, it's not untypical to hear 3.9% plus CPI. Is CPI going to hit 4% for the whole of this year? It's certainly up at the high threes at the moment. So it's quite possible that your deal today goes up by 8% next year. And then if you've locked in for a third year as well, in that third year, 2 years from now, goes up another 8%. And that can be a significant difference again between two deals, that day one, deal A looks really good, but in year three of that deal, actually you should have gone for vendor B, option B. because they didn't have an inflationary clause. So again, it's just common sense modeling. The further aspect, and again, this sort of overlaps into another topic we'll talk about, is increased data usage. So data usage is only going upwards. There's some reasons, we'll go into that in a moment, I'm sure, John. But again, your spend today might be higher in year 2, year 3, plus then inflation on top. There's a further compounding of that.
Yeah, so you could, I mean, we're talking here pretty material, because when you hear, oh, going up by inflation, it's easy to say, oh, 1 or 2%, do I care? But where you're talking about, CPI plus 3.9, you're absolutely right. You easily, and hey, I mean, you only have to read any newspaper to see, a lot of concern about inflation, interest rates potentially rising, blah blah blah. It's not, you probably would have to do your modelling at the moment that could mean an 8% year-on-year compounded growth.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
It's quite a number.
The first thing to do is try and not have it. This is an enterprise deal. It's a big deal. I want fixed pricing. Don't be ridiculous with your inflation clauses. Go away, please. However, that doesn't always work. Depends on the vendor, the size of the deal, etc. What other negotiations are ongoing, what other aspects you're looking to achieve in a deal. But if you haven't negotiated that way, absolutely you have to factor in 8%, I think, at the moment for those sort of deals, and that will have a material impact.
And presumably, I mean, I know one of the things we're fond of saying in any procurement process is, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? So if you get the inflation clause taken out, essentially you're saying to the service provider, you're gonna, are they just going to take that out and not want to see, some compensation elsewhere in the deal, etc. Is this a case that, to some extent, and we will talk about whether prices are coming down or going up, but they've sort of started, they've put the start bar of the negotiations 8% higher than it used to be.
So I think we're in a magic moment for certainly for the next couple of months, maybe, whereby inflation is obviously significant. It's in the news. Your gas bills are going up, your electric's going up, your food's gone up. Have the mobile network operators had to put many of their costs up in terms of staffing in particular? So yes, running a mobile network, maybe the electricity to do so is costing them more, but I don't think they've yet had the full impact of inflation into their cost model. So I think you're at this moment where there will be people in their operation going, and quite rightly from their point of view, being prudent, we need to have inflation protection in our contracts with our customers because inflation is coming. But they're in a period where it hasn't really hit them hard yet. Therefore, you've probably got this magic period of a few months where you hopefully can negotiate it away. My fear is that inflation stays high through the winter. You'll get to the new year, possibly, pay demands start hitting these vendors, and they have to actually start enforcing this, and they won't give it away in the negotiation. And then you're even more correct that there'll be an impact to something else. So if you're still using a tech fund, your tech fund goes down, or we'll do away with the inflation clause, but we'll have to start you at a higher rate anyway to make up for it.
So, because that's interesting. I know we're going to talk about 5G and we will get to it, but just very quickly, while we're on sort of deal mechanics, if you like, tech funds still alive and well, prices still coming down. It feels that the narrative we've been saying about mobile deals is continuing, albeit perhaps that price, the at a big picture, the price of a gig of data, for example, that's still coming down, even if the deal mechanics get a little bit more complex around it. Is that a sort of fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. So the comparisons we do to previous procurements still show significant savings, but those savings are being eroded by two main things, I guess. One is the sort of inflationary clauses, whether it's EU roaming, whether it's an inflation clause itself, and 2 is increased usage. So we can again try not to steal from our future selves, John, in this podcast, but there are reasons why data usage is going up. Some of which is just inevitable increased use of mobile devices for data consumption. So more video usage, more just generally life continues to be lived more on your mobile than anything else. So year on year, data usage is going up. So whilst the price per gig is definitely coming down, and we're still seeing dramatic falls in that, people and enterprises are using more data. So as the price comes down, you're actually the probable spend may be down year on year, but maybe by year 3, it's back to where it was in year 0.
I was going to say, you get that kind of slight kind of not quite U-shape, but it's not equally, it doesn't just drop and stay dropped. It kind of drops and creeps back.
Yeah.
Okay. That's really interesting. I'm conscious we are getting towards our time, but I do want to touch on 5G quickly. 5G demand, but also just a kind of a view on the reality of 5G right this minute. Is 5G something people listening to this podcast who are facing into a mobile procurement, is 5G high on their agenda? Should it be high on their agenda? What's your take on it?
There's been a lot of hype, a lot of marketing, a lot of advertising, a lot of talk about 5G. We've discussed this hype for 3-4 years, I guess. There are still no killer apps out there that require 5G. I think the number one use of 5G, I'm going to be bold here, is showing your colleague or friend or interested punter in the pub your speed test result.
You're only saying that because you've had me showing you my speed test results on the regular.
And I was literally talking to a senior account director at one of the MNOs yesterday who told me that they'd just got a 5G phone and all they've done so far is a speed test. And I was like, this is music to my ears. So look, 5G is the future, undoubtedly. This is a repetition of what we saw with 4G. The first few years, low coverage, low number of devices, low number of apps that utilize the benefits of that generation of mobile technology. But after a few years, you begin to get apps that are feature rich, that require the low latency, that require the greater speed. But today, in short, and I know we've got other material on our website if people want to look at it in more detail. Today, there's no real business justification for having a 5G device. They cost more, coverage is very patchy. There's not much more that you can do with it other than speedily download data if you happen to be in coverage. For most people, the amount of data they're consuming, they can do perfectly well on 4G or on Wi-Fi. There's no real benefit. The only real use case that I can see today, particularly for a handheld 5G device, is if you're about to step on a plane and want to download 5 hours of content quickly because you've got to do it last night when you're on your home Wi-Fi. How much of that is relevant to business and how much is it actually the sort of personal use? I'll leave individual organizations to discuss their usage policy. But beyond that, 5G definitely has its place, but I don't think it's in the handheld device. Obviously, we're seeing some trials of campus technology using 5G to flood ports and universities, things of that nature, hospitals, instead of Wi-Fi, or to complement Wi-Fi. And again, we go into more detail on some of our other insight material, but I'll leave it there for now. I think, John, that probably answers your question.
No, that's fantastic. Very, very interesting. Very, very well summarized. So I'm very conscious we're running out of time for today's podcast, so we are going to have to draw it to a close. Adrian, thank you so much for providing us with your insight today. It's been really, really interesting, and I'm sure our viewers and listeners will have got a lot out of that, and particularly understanding the risk profile of what they're about to face into. So that's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Please do let us know any questions you may have about this or any other network and telecoms topic. You can get in touch with us through our website, networkcollective.co.uk, or any of the usual social channels. We look forward to talking with you again soon. Thank you.